Welcome to the Weird and Wonderful channel. Across the world, television has always been a mirror, but some countries have polished theirs with old stories, darker stories, the kind whispered between generations, and carried across village roads like drifting smoke. Folk horror didn't bloom in just Britain or America. It's a worldwide thicket, thick with superstition, ancestral fear, and a sense that the land remembers more than we do. Today we're wandering through that global landscape. So settle in, my friends, as we explore international folk horror on television, a journey through cultures, other ghosts, and other ways the past refuses to stay buried. Section 1. Scandinavia, the Haunted North. The Scandinavian countries have always had a special relationship with the wilderness. Forests that seem endless, winters that swallow the sun, and folklore packed with restless creatures older than Christianity itself. One standout is Jordskott from Sweden. Part crime drama, part pagan mystery, the series pulls us into a forest inhabited by ancient beings that do not care about human rules. The show's slow, creeping dread builds around the idea that nature is alive, and it can be vengeful. Norway gives us Ragnarok, which reimagines Norse mythology in a contemporary setting, not quite horror, but threaded with that folk horror suspicion that climate disasters are a form of divine retribution. And in Finland, the series Karpi, known internationally as Deadwind, often brushes up against the edges of folk belief, burial grounds, ancestral spirits, and landscapes that feel complicit in the violence. Scandinavia reminds us that folk horror doesn't always need a monster. Sometimes the land itself is enough. Section 2. Japan. Folklore that breathes. Japan has an unusually potent connection between folklore and modern storytelling. Their ghosts and yokai aren't quaint relics. They feel very much alive, moving effortlessly between the past and present. One excellent entry is Yamishibai, Japanese ghost stories, short, minimalist animated tales told in the style of paper theatre. Every episode distills some piece of Japanese urban or rural legend into a few minutes of dread. It's folk horror stripped to its bones. Japan also produced Kwaidan, pronounced Kwaidan, originally a 1960s anthology, but revived and reinterpreted in various forms over the decades. Each story feels like stepping into an old scroll painting where spirits drift quietly behind sliding doors. And of course, Japanese dramas and anime frequently weave in folk elements, mountains with their own gods, forests with their own laws, and spirits who punish disrespect. Even when it isn't labelled folk horror, the DNA is unmistakable. Section 3. South Korea. Traditional fear in modern settings. Korean television is no stranger to the supernatural, but shows that lean into folk horror do so with a level of emotional depth that has made Korean media globally beloved. One of the strongest examples is The Guest, a chilling series that combines exorcism, shamanism, and Korean folk belief about vengeful spirits. It's all about generational curses, the sins of the village, and the invisible forces that bind people to tragedies long after they should have ended. Another is Kingdom, Netflix's historical zombie series, but its roots are deeply folk-based. Herbal medicine, burial rituals, societal taboos, and the corruption of royal bloodlines all feed into the horror. The plague itself feels ancient, ritualistic, and disturbingly inevitable. Korean folk horror often asks a painful question: what happens when tradition, modernity, and trauma collide? Section 4. Latin America, the land of living myths. In Latin America, folklore isn't something tucked into dusty books. It's part of daily life. Stories of La Llorona, El Silbón, and restless spirits shaped by colonialism and the mixing of indigenous, African, and European traditions create folklore that feels deeply personal and deeply haunted. Mexico's Diablero brings together urban fantasy, indigenous lore, and Catholic demonology. It's fast-paced and fun, but beneath that is a landscape shaped by centuries of spiritual tension. Brazil gives us Invisible City, which follows folkloric spirits like the river-dwelling Iara or the trickster Curupira. The show's whole premise is that myth never died. It's simply adapted to modern life, hiding in alleyways and riverbanks, waiting for humans to notice again. What makes Latin American folk horror so potent is the blend of beauty and brutality, the sense that every story comes from real suffering, real resilience, real memory. Section 5. Eastern Europe, where old gods linger. Eastern Europe may be the closest cousin to British folk horror, but where Britain has pastoral fear, Eastern Europe has pagan echoes wrapped in centuries of invasion, superstition, and survival. In Poland, the series Wataha uses the Bieszczady Mountains, remote, eerie, nearly untouched, as a silent antagonist. You always feel you're intruding. Russia has produced numerous folk-related miniseries, many drawing from Slavic mythology, domovoi, rusalki, forest spirits, and ancient gods who despise human arrogance. Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary often lean on occultism, ancestral curses, and the belief that evil is something inherited rather than summoned. Eastern European folk horror feels heavy, as if every story carries the weight of an entire haunted continent. Section 6. Africa. Spiritual realism meets horror. Africa's folk traditions are rich, layered, and spiritually grounded. African horror tends to be less about fear for entertainment and more about respect. The recognition that the spirit world and the living world are deeply connected. One powerful example is South Africa's Dead Places, a series where a writer investigates supernatural events across the continent. Each case draws from real folk beliefs, ancestors, curses, protectors, and spirits that walk beside the living. Nigeria's Nollywood has also embraced folk horror themes for decades, especially around witchcraft, village curses, and ancestral spirits. Even when the production style is different from Western media, the storytelling is raw and compelling. In African folk horror, the central question is often, what happens when the living break the covenant with the unseen? Section 7. Why international folk horror matters. Stepping outside the English-speaking world reveals something profound. Folk horror is universal, but each culture expresses it differently. In Scandinavia, the land itself is alive. In Japan, spirits never stopped walking. In Korea, trauma becomes supernatural. In Latin America, myth breathes alongside the living. In Eastern Europe, ancient gods refuse to be forgotten. In Africa, the line between the living and the dead is beautifully thin. These stories show us that folk horror isn't a genre, it's a language. A way of understanding our relationship to history, community, and the unseen forces that shaped us long before we were born. Closing. So that's our journey through international folk horror on television. A tour of haunted villages, sacred forests, restless ancestors, and myths that refuse to fade. In the next episode, we'll continue exploring the many branches of the folk horror tree, each one twisted, fascinating, and surprisingly human. Until then, keep your lights low, your doors locked, and never forget, the past is never as far away as you think. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. And check out my books on Amazon. Be seeing you.